Tear that ugly windmill down, or I'll fine you into bankruptcy. Darlene Pute, oh, a tyrant with her laminated badge and smug grin, screeched her golf cart to a halt in my driveway, leaped out, and stabbed her finger in my grandfather's windmill like it personally offended her. No hello, no warning, just pure entitlement. I stood there, coffee steaming in my hand, as this woman who'd ignored me for a decade demanded I destroy the one thing that supplied clean water to her sink and every house on this cul-de-sac for 32 years, including hers. You know what that thing actually does? I asked. She sneered. I don't care. It looks trashy. Covenants say remove it. 30 days, $100 per day after. She flung the certified letter at me and peeled out. Fatal error. Because if those blades stop turning, every faucet here goes bone dry. Starting with hers. I've got the valve in my hand, ready to twist. Worst HOA nightmare you've survived. Drop your city and state in the comments. I'm reading every one tonight. Picture the Texas Hill Country in mid-October, when the cedar elms have turned the color of old pennies and the air smells like dust and diesel and the faint sweetness of someone burning brush 2 fields over. That is where I grew up. That is where I stayed. My name is Gentry Callahan. I'm 54 years old. I run a small agricultural supply business out of a converted equipment barn about 3 miles east of Kerrville, and I live on the same 7-acre parcel my grandfather, Olin Callahan, bought for back taxes in 1968. Not because I couldn't leave. I had offers, a scholarship to UT Austin, a girl who wanted to move to Denver a decade or so where I thought maybe I'd become somebody different. But the land had a weight to it, the kind you feel in your boot soles when you walk it at dawn. I came back at 31 and never looked west again. The windmill is the first thing you see when you turn off Route 16 on a Crescent Fork Drive. It stands 42 feet tall, hand-welded galvanized steel, 8-blade fan assembly, cast-iron gearbox that Grandpa Olin bought salvage from a Deaf Smith County ranch in 1988. It sits over a limestone aquifer that hasn't run dry in recorded county history. For decades, that windmill fed a gravity flow system Grandpa rigged himself. Water rises into a 500-gallon storage tank on a cedar post tower, then distributes by pipe to the 11 homes that got built around my property when Crescent Fork was platted as a residential subdivision in the mid-1990s. Here is the critical piece that becomes very important later. Before a single house was built, Grandpa Olin negotiated a recorded water service easement with the original developer. The easement runs with the land. Every deed on Crescent Fork Drive references it. It is in the dry language of Kerr County property law, a pertinent easement for the conveyance of groundwater. The HOA was formed in 2003. Darlene Pute became president in 2018 after running essentially unopposed. Her one competitor withdrew after what multiple neighbors described as a prolonged and uncomfortable conversation about resale values. Darlene is 61, retired from a title insurance company in San Antonio, and she has brought to her HOA presidency the focused energy of someone who peaked professionally and is not prepared to admit it. She sends emails at 11 p.m. She carries a printed copy of the covenants in a 3-ring binder to every annual meeting. She once issued a formal warning to a neighbor, Bo Treadwell, for a wind chime she deemed acoustically intrusive. The first time she came for the windmill, it was a friendly notice slipped under my door in March. Pastel yellow paper printed in Comic Sans, which somehow made it worse. The windmill, she wrote, did not conform to the neighborhood's architectural aesthetic. She included a photograph she had apparently taken from the road with the windmill circled in red marker. I folded it in half, stuck it in the kitchen junk drawer, and forgot about it. That was my first mistake, not taking Darlene Pute seriously. By August, the friendly notice had become a certified letter, 30 days. Remove the structure or face fines of $150 per day. I stood at my mailbox in the August heat, the metal hot enough to sting through my work gloves, the kind of dry Texas heat that makes the air shimmer off the asphalt, and I read that letter twice. Then I walked inside, poured a glass of well water over ice, and started making calls. The thing about petty authority is that it almost always overestimates how many weapons it has. Darlene scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting, Just her vice president Floyd Garza, and the treasurer, a quiet retired pharmacist named Otis Williams, who would later become important to this story for very different reasons. The three of them voted 2-1 to formally cite me for violation and begin the fine accrual clock. Otis was the dissenting vote. He told me later he'd asked Darlene point blank, "What happens to the water?" She told him the city would handle it. There is no city water service on Crescent Fork Drive. Darlene either didn't know this or she knew and didn't care. Neither option speaks well of her. I got the formal citation on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, I was sitting across a wood veneer desk from a real estate attorney named Philippa Broward in a small office above a barbecue joint on Water Street. The smell of mesquite smoke drifting up through the floorboards the entire meeting. I had my grandfather's original easement documents spread out in front of her. Philippa read slowly, made small sounds of approval, and then looked up at me over her reading glasses. "You know what this is?" "About a guess," I said. "This is an appurtenant easement recorded in 1994 that runs with the title of every property on that cul-de-sac. It is not subject to HOA covenants. The HOA was formed 9 years after this easement was recorded. They cannot vote to extinguish it. They don't have the legal authority. A homeowners association can regulate paint colors and mailbox heights. It cannot override a real property easement that predates its own existence." She tapped the page. "If Darlene shuts down that windmill, she's not enforcing an HOA rule. She's interfering with a legal property right of 11 homeowners, including herself." That last part, including herself, I'll let that settle. Philippa drafted what she called a preservation of rights letter, a formal legal notice putting the HOA on notice of the easement and the legal exposure they were creating by pursuing the citation. It was 3 pages of dense property law language, and it closed with a sentence that, in the polite cadence of legal correspondence, essentially said, "Proceed with fines, and we will see you in Kerr County District Court." I certified mailed it to Darlene, Floyd, and Otis on a Friday afternoon. Darlene's response came 8 days later. She had found her own attorney, a general practice guy in Fredericksburg, who mostly did wills and business incorporations and had, as near as I could tell, last handled a property rights case sometime during the George W. Bush administration. His letter informed me that the HOA's covenants took precedence, that the easement language was ambiguous, and that I should expect continued citation and fines. Ambiguous. I had the original survey, the original deed language, and 30 years of unbroken use. Ambiguous was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that letter. I did 2 things. First, I paid the first fine, $150 check cut and certified mailed, because I wanted a paper trail showing I was engaging in good faith. Second, I called Otis Williams. Otis picked up on the second ring. He sounded relieved that someone had called. We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, I understood 3 things. Darlene had not consulted the full HOA membership before issuing the citation. The board vote had not been properly noticed per the HOA's own bylaws, which required 72 hours written notice to all homeowners before any enforcement action. And Otis, quiet, careful, pharmacist precise Otis, had been keeping notes. He'd been keeping notes for 2 years. Darlene, to her credit, did not back down when she got the attorney letter. I respect that in an antagonist. She doubled down, which is both her greatest flaw and the reason this story ends the way it does. Her next move was to contact Kerr County Code Enforcement. She filed a complaint alleging the windmill was an unpermitted structure that posed a safety risk to adjacent properties. A county inspector named Warren Shell drove out on a Wednesday morning, boots crunching on the caliche gravel of my driveway, clipboard in hand, looking vaguely like a man who already knew this was going to be a long day. He walked the perimeter. He measured. He photographed the foundation and the gearbox and the guy wire anchors. He also checked the county records. The windmill had been permitted in 1991. Grandpa Olin had pulled every required permit, structure, water well, distribution system, and they were all on file at the county clerk's office. Warren Shell handed me his card, said, "Looks like everything's in order," and drove away. The inspection took 22 minutes. Darlene's code enforcement gambit dead on arrival. But here's where it got uglier. The week after the inspection, I started hearing things. Darlene had been talking to neighbors. Specifically, she had been telling people that my well water was unregulated and potentially unsafe, and suggesting that the reason she wanted the windmill removed was actually for their health and protection. She repeated this at the Crescent Fork Drive block party, an event I wasn't invited to, held in the cul-de-sac in front of my own property line. And according to 3 different neighbors who texted me that night, she had said my water tested positive for something. She didn't specify what. She didn't need to. Fear is a lot more portable than facts. I had my water tested the following Monday. I used the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality Certified Lab in San Antonio, paid the rush fee, and got results back in 4 days. The water was clean. It met every EPA standard for pH, turbidity, coliform bacteria, nitrates, arsenic, lead, and a dozen other parameters. The lab report was 14 pages long and read like the most boring document ever produced in the state of Texas. It was, however, a very powerful document. I had copies made. I walked those copies to all 11 houses on Crescent Fork Drive, knocked on each door, introduced myself to the people I hadn't spoken to in years, handed them the report, and explained calmly, clearly, without once mentioning Darlene by name, what the water test showed, how the windmill worked, and what the easement meant for their property rights. The responses varied. Some neighbors were grateful. Some were nervous and wanted to talk to their own lawyers. 3 of them, including a retired civil engineer named Harlan Cross who lived 3 houses down and had apparently been quietly furious at Darlene for 18 months about an unrelated fence dispute, told me directly that they were on my side and would show up if I needed witnesses. Harlan pulled me aside on his front porch and said in the flat, declarative tone of a man who had spent 40 years building things that didn't fall down, she told my wife the windmill was an eyesore. My wife asked her who decides what's an eyesore. Darlene said, and I'm quoting here, "I do." He let that hang in the air between us for a second. I've got documentation of 6 procedural violations in her conduct since 2021. I've just been waiting for the right moment. The right moment was coming. I just didn't know how fast. By October, Darlene had accumulated 120 days of fines on paper. $18,000 she had no legal mechanism to actually collect. But the number looked impressive in the letter she sent to all Crescent Fork homeowners calling for a special vote. The agenda item: amend the HOA covenants to formally prohibit agricultural-grade water infrastructure in the subdivision and authorize the board to pursue legal action to enforce the windmill removal. This was actually a clever move in a narrow, legally myopic sort of way. She was trying to create new covenant language specifically designed to address the windmill, which might give her attorney something to argue in court. She needed a 2/3 supermajority of all homeowners to amend the covenants. There were 22 lots on Crescent Fork Drive. She needed 15 votes. I attended that meeting. It was held on a Tuesday night in the garage of Floyd Garza's house, which smelled like motor oil and old carpet and had one of those hanging fluorescent lights that buzzes at a frequency that lives behind your eyes. 14 people showed up in folding chairs. Darlene stood at a whiteboard with her 3-ring binder and presented her case with the polished confidence of someone who had rehearsed it. She talked about aesthetics. She talked about property values. She said the windmill was a remnant of a prior land use that was incompatible with a modern residential community. She did not talk about water, which was interesting because water was the only thing that mattered. Then I stood up. I had 3 minutes of floor time under HOA bylaws. I used every second. I explained the easement. I explained what would happen to water service if the windmill came down, specifically that there was no backup plan, no municipal connection, and no realistic path to one given the cost of running a water line 3 miles from the nearest city main. I passed around copies of the TCQ lab report. I said quietly and clearly that anyone who voted to amend those covenants was voting to create a water emergency for their own home. The vote failed. Darlene got 9. She needed 15. She did not take it gracefully. In the parking area afterward, I heard her tell Floyd that she would find another way. Floyd looked uncomfortable. Otis, who had been sitting in the back row taking notes on a yellow legal pad, caught my eye on the way out and gave me a small, deliberate nod. I didn't know it yet, but Otis had found something. He called me the next morning and asked if I could meet him at the coffee shop on Sidney Baker Street. He arrived carrying a manila folder and ordered a decoff like a man preparing to deliver news that required a clear head. "I've been going through the HOA financials," he said. He opened the folder. "Darlene has been collecting a management fee for her services as president. It's buried in the operating budget under administrative services. $3,000 a year paid to an LLC she owns called Pute Property Solutions." I looked at the documents. Is that legal? Under our covenants, board members are explicitly prohibited from receiving compensation for board service without unanimous member approval. There has never been a member vote on this. He tapped the folder. "She's been paying herself for 4 years, $12,000. That's self-dealing. At minimum," Otis said carefully. Philippa Broward would use a stronger word. I called Philippa that afternoon. She used the word breach of fiduciary duty. She also said, with the calm professionalism of someone mentally calculating billable hours, that we now had leverage, real leverage, the kind that changes the conversation entirely. Up to this point, I'd been playing defense, responding to citations, getting legal opinions, knocking on doors, attending meetings, keeping records. I was fighting on ground Darlene had chosen. Now the ground was shifting, and it was shifting because Otis Williams had been doing something that I think should be recognized as a genuine act of civic courage. For 2 years, quietly, without telling anyone except his wife, he had been building a file. The file contained the self-dealing payments, but it also contained something else. Otis had pulled the original HOA formation documents from the county clerk, documents that Darlene apparently believed nobody would ever read. And he had found a clause that was, to put plainly, a bombshell. The HOA's own formation documents, drafted in 2003 by the original developer before he sold the last lots and walked away, contained a provision in Article 7, Section 3. The Homeowners Association was explicitly prohibited from taking any action that would interfere with the water service easement recorded in instrument number 19940044782 in the Kerr County Real Property Records. The original developer, apparently a cautious man, had made the easement protection part of the HOA's own governing structure. Darlene had been trying to use the HOA to attack an easement that the HOA's own founding documents protected. She either never read Article 7, Philippa told me when I brought her the documents, or she read it and gambled that you hadn't. Which is worse? I asked. Philippa gave me a look that answered the question without words. This meant we now had 2 distinct legal issues on the table. Issue 1. The Windmill citation was not just unenforceable. It was a direct violation of the HOA's own governing documents, which potentially exposed Darlene and the board to personal liability. Issue 2. The self-dealing payments were a breach of fiduciary duty, which under Texas nonprofit corporation law, HOAs in Texas are typically formed as nonprofit corporations, could mean personal liability for Darlene and potentially Floyd if he had known and approved. Philippa laid out 3 options. Option 1. File suit immediately, go public with everything, and let the courts handle it. Option 2. Send a demand letter giving Darlene 60 days to resign, repay the funds, and formally withdraw all citations. Option 3. And this was the one that made me sit back in my chair. Wait. Let Darlene make one more move. Let her go further, because the further she went, the more exposed she became, and the more satisfying the conclusion. I'm not a patient man by nature. I have my grandfather's temper and my grandmother's stubbornness, which is a difficult combination in a negotiation. But I looked at Otis, who was sitting in the chair beside me with his legal pad and his decoff, and I remembered what he'd said at the coffee shop. I've been waiting for the right moment for 2 years. I told Philippa, option 3. We wait, but we prepare. The preparation phase lasted about 6 weeks, and it was one of the most satisfying periods of my adult life. There is a particular pleasure in building something that a person with bad intentions is going to walk directly into, and I experienced that pleasure in full. Step 1 was documentation infrastructure. I hired a licensed surveyor to formally document the windmill's location, the well, the distribution system, and every point where the water lines crossed other properties. This produced a legal survey drawing, stamped and signed, admissible in court, that established beyond any possible dispute the physical scope of the water service operation. Cost: $1,100. If Darlene wanted to claim the windmill was just a decorative structure, this drawing made that argument impossible. Step 2 was the easement quiet title action. Philippa filed a quiet title petition in Kerr County District Court asking the court to formally confirm and record the scope of a 1994 easement. A quiet title action is a legal proceeding that definitively establishes who owns a property right. In this case, the right of all 11 homes to receive water service from my well. Once a court grants quiet title, that determination is permanent and binding on everyone, including any future HOA boards. It's the legal equivalent of putting up a concrete wall. Nobody gets to re-argue it. Filing fee: $430. Service of process on the HOA: $65. Step 3 was the physical preparation. And this is the part that the neighbors still talk about. Harlan Cross and I spent 3 weekends building a secondary water storage system. 2 additional 500-gallon polyethylene tanks on a reinforced cedar post tower fed by a secondary pump line from the aquifer as a backup to the windmill's primary gravity flow. The tanks were connected to the distribution system through a valve manifold Harlan designed. If anyone cut off the windmill's mechanical operation, the backup tanks would maintain water service for approximately 8 to 10 days, more than enough time to get a court injunction. The backup system was entirely on my property. It was entirely permitted, and it was entirely invisible from the road, tucked behind the equipment barn behind a cedar hedge row that had been growing there since 1985. Darlene would never see it coming. Step 4 was the coalition. I had by this point 7 of the 11 Crescent Fork homeowners actively on my side. Harlan Cross had his documentation of Darlene's procedural violations. Otis had the financial records. A neighbor named Shelby Prudhomme, no relation to Darlene, a coincidence she apparently found irritating, was a paralegal and had offered to help organize the documentary evidence. 2 other neighbors had agreed to provide sworn affidavits about Darlene's public statements regarding the water quality, including her claim that the water was unsafe. Step 5 was the press. I made a phone call to a reporter named Van Tillotson at the Kerrville Daily Times who covered local government and property disputes. I didn't give him the story yet. I just told him there was a story coming about an HOA water dispute and gave him enough context to understand why it mattered. Van told me to call him when it was time. Now, here's the legal financial architecture in plain terms because I think it's worth understanding. The combination of a recorded easement, a quiet title action, and the HOA's own Article 7 meant that Darlene's citation was not just wrong. It was actionable in 3 separate directions. First, as a violation of her own organization's governing documents, which exposed her personally. Second, as tortious interference with a property right, which is a civil claim I could bring against her individually. Third, as a basis for a declaratory judgment that the windmill could never be subject to HOA enforcement permanently. We weren't just defending the windmill. We were building a legal structure that would protect it forever and protect every homeowner's water rights with it. When someone comes at a recorded easement with HOA covenants, they're bringing a butter knife to a geological survey. It doesn't end well for the butter knife. I spent those 6 weeks doing this work in the evenings and on weekends after the supply business closed and after supper, sitting at the same kitchen table where Grandpa Olin used to do his books. The wood is scarred and stained, and the legs are slightly uneven, and I have never once considered replacing it. Outside the window, the windmill turned in the night breeze, slow and steady. The metal groan of the gearbox carrying across the dark yard the way it always had. Some sound become part of you. That one's been part of me since I was 4 years old. Darlene made her first major mistake in early November. She hired someone. I don't know exactly how she found him. My best theory involved a conversation at the bar at the Crescent Fork Country Club, which is about 6 miles from the neighborhood and has approximately zero relationship to Crescent Fork Drive, but is where Darlene apparently did most of her strategizing. His name, as best I could determine, was Dale. and he arrived on a Thursday evening in a white pickup truck with no company markings. Pulled off the road onto the county right-of-way adjacent to my property and spent about 40 minutes examining the Windmill's guy wire anchors from a distance. I know this because I have trail cameras. I have had trail cameras since 2019 when a neighbor's dog kept getting into my equipment shed. They cover the driveway, the well housing, the base of the windmill, and the property perimeter along Route 16. They send motion-triggered clips to my phone. At 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday in November, my phone buzzed 17 times in 20 minutes. Dale did not touch anything that night. He left. I downloaded the clips, time-stamped them, and emailed them to Philippa. She sent a letter to the HOA the next morning noting that any interference with the windmill structure or the water distribution system would constitute criminal trespass and potentially criminal mischief under Texas Penal Code Section 2803, which is a felony if the damage exceeds $2,500. She also mentioned in that same letter that she was now aware of possible surveillance activities and that any such activity would be documented and addressed accordingly. Texas Penal Code 2803. Criminal mischief causing damage over $2,500 is a state jail felony. Messing with infrastructure isn't a civil matter. It's a criminal one. Dale did not come back. Darlene's second move was more direct. On a Saturday morning in mid-November, she knocked on my door. She was dressed in what I can only describe as business casual for a person who wanted to appear approachable. Pressed jeans, a blazer, her lanyard absent for once. She had a check in her hand, $10,000, made out to Gentry Callahan, drawn on an account that appeared to be personal. She held it out like a peace offering and told me she wanted to resolve the dispute amicably and that this was compensation for the inconvenience. I didn't take the check. I also didn't close the door. Darlene, I said, I have a security camera on this porch. It's been recording since you knocked. She looked at the small black housing above the door frame. Then she looked back at me. What you are offering me in exchange for dropping a legal action, recorded on video, meets the definition of an improper payment in a pending legal matter. I talked to a lawyer before you finished that sentence. She put the check back in her blazer pocket. We looked at each other for a moment. The air smelled like cedar and wood smoke and the particular cold of a Texas November morning that gets under your collar. You should know, I said, that the quiet title hearing is scheduled for the 14th, and there are things on the record now that you probably need to be aware of. I let that sit. Have a good morning, Darlene. I closed the door. I pulled the porch camera footage immediately and sent it to Philippa with a subject line that read, "You're going to want to see this." Philippa called me back within 20 minutes. Her voice had the careful, controlled energy of a lawyer who has just been handed something very good. She said she was going to advise the HOA's attorney of the incident. She said the attempted payment on video in the context of pending litigation was the kind of thing that tends to accelerate a defendant's willingness to settle. I told her to hold on settling. I wasn't ready to settle. Darlene's last move before the climax was to call a full HOA annual meeting for the first Saturday in December. She sent notices to all 22 lots. She reserved the fellowship hall at the First Methodist Church on Main Street, which seats about 100 people and has the particular acoustic quality of a room where bad news travels very clearly. She hired, and I mean this literally, a presentation clicker and a projector. She was going to make a show of it. I heard about the agenda from Otis, who is still technically on the board and still technically receiving all board communications. The agenda had 3 items: property values, neighborhood aesthetics, and infrastructure concerns. Under infrastructure concerns, Darlene had prepared a slide deck. I would learn later it was 14 slides, arguing that the windmill was a safety hazard, that the water system was unregulated, and that the neighborhood should vote to formally request county intervention to force the windmill's removal. She had apparently decided that if she couldn't get the HOA to act, she would try to generate enough public pressure to get the county to act. It was not a bad strategy, except for the fact that the county had already inspected the structure and found 0 violations, that the TCQ water test results existed, and that the quiet title hearing was 13 days away. I came to that meeting prepared. I came with Harlan Cross, Shelby Prudhomme, Otis, and 4 other neighbors. I came with a folder. I also, and this was Shelby's idea, and it was a good one, contacted Van Tillotson at the Kerrville Daily Times and told him a meeting was a matter of public concern affecting access to water for residential properties and that he might want to attend. Van brought a notebook and a photographer. A local reporter at an HOA meeting changes the energy of the room in a very specific way. Darlene noticed Van immediately. Her jaw tightened. She asked him publicly why he was there. He said he was covering a story about residential water rights. She told him this was a private meeting. He pointed out, accurately, that under Texas law, meetings of organizations that govern private covenants affecting property rights are not in fact private when members of the governed community are present. He was cordial about it. He was also not leaving. Darlene went through her slide deck. It was, in the cold light of everything I now knew, a performance of remarkable brazenness. She showed photographs of the windmill. She used the words industrial structure for times. She said the water system had not been independently verified for safety, at which point several neighbors looked at each other with the expression of people who had received a 14-page TCQ lab report. And she suggested the county could be petitioned to require municipal water connection as a condition of continued residential occupancy. Municipal water connection for Crescent Fork Drive would cost, by the most conservative estimate I had obtained from a licensed plumber named Gordon V.A., between $8,000 and $15,000 per lot, plus the cost of the mainline extension from a city. For a street of 22 homes, you were looking at a minimum of $300,000 in infrastructure costs. Darlene had put that on the table as a solution. I waited until she opened the floor for questions. Then I stood up. Darlene, I said, I have a few documents I'd like to share with the group. I walked to the front of the room, my boots loud on the linoleum, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and I put 3 things on the table in front of the projector. The TCQ water test results, the HOA formation document showing Article 7, and the Kerr County District Court filing showing the quiet title petition. I'd also like to note, I said, for the record and for anyone taking notes, that under the HOA's own formation documents, Article 7, Section 3, the board is expressly prohibited from taking any action interfering with the water service easement this windmill serves. Any member vote to petition for its removal would itself be a violation of our governing documents. The room was very quiet, and I'd like to ask the treasurer, I said, looking at Otis, if he would be willing to speak to the membership about the line item in the operating budget labeled Administrative Services. Otis stood up. He had his legal pad. He spoke for 4 minutes in the flat, precise voice of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something true. He explained the payments. He explained the LLC. He named the amount. He named the years. Darlene said those payments were disclosed. Otis said simply, to whom? Nobody in the room could answer that question, including Darlene. The quiet title hearing was on a Thursday morning, December 14th, in the Kerr County District Courtroom on Earl Garrett Street. It is a 1920s courthouse with marble floors and tall windows and the smell of old wood and paper that accumulates in government buildings over a century. I arrived early enough to hear my own footsteps echo. Darlene was there with her attorney. Floyd Garza was not. He had resigned from the board 10 days earlier, quietly by email, citing personal reasons. 2 of the neighbors I'd spoken to were in the gallery. Van Tillotson was in the gallery. Otis was in the gallery with his legal pad, as he always was. The hearing itself was, by legal standards, not dramatic. Philippa presented the easement documents, the formation documents, the recorded survey, the chain of title. The HOA's attorney made his ambiguous argument. Judge Arlene Fitch, 67 years old, Kerr County native, 22 years on the bench, asked him, in the patient tone of someone who has heard a great deal of property law in her time, to specify which language in the 1994 easement he considered ambiguous. He specified. She looked at the document. She looked at him. She said, Counsel, the language says perpetual and appurtenant running with the land in fee simple. That is among the least ambiguous formulations in Texas property law. Are you prepared to argue otherwise? He was not. It emerged, prepared to argue otherwise. Judge Fitch granted quiet title. She confirmed the easement, its scope, and its permanent and binding nature on all lots in the Crescent Fork subdivision. She also issued a declaratory judgment on Philippa's motion that no HOA covenant or board action could lawfully interfere with the easement's operation. She signed the order in about 4 minutes. The courtroom clerk stamped it. It would be recorded in the county property records by end of business. Then came the part that Van Tillotson wrote about in his article the following Tuesday. Outside the courthouse on the front steps in the December cold, the sky the particular white-gray of a Texas winter morning, the air smelling of cedar and exhaust from Earl Garrett Street. Darlene stopped me. "You realize this isn't over," she said. I looked at her. She was in her blazer again. Nolan Yarth. Her attorney was already walking to his car. "Darlene," I said, "I want to show you something." I pulled out my phone. I opened the trail camera footage from November. Dale, the white truck, the 40 minutes of circling my property. I showed her the timestamp. I showed her the plate number, which I had run through a public vehicle record search. I also have the porch footage from the morning you brought the check, I said. Philippa has copies of everything. The Kerrville Daily Times has been briefed, and the HOA's financial records, the ones with the LLC payments, have been referred to the Texas Secretary of State's office for review because HOA boards in Texas are governed by nonprofit corporation statutes, and self-dealing is a reportable issue. I was not shouting. I was not angry, or at least I wasn't showing it. I had my grandfather's voice in my head, Olin Callahan, who had built that windmill with his own hands and never once needed to raise his voice to make a point. And I kept mine level. "I don't want your resignation today," I said. "I want you to go home, call a lawyer who actually practices property law, and think hard about the difference between a fight you can win and one you've already lost. The windmill stays. The water keeps running. And the next time you knock on my door, make sure you've read Article 7 first." Van Tillotson, standing 6 feet away with his notebook, wrote all of that down. His article ran the following Tuesday under the headline, "Kerr County Court Affirms Water Rights in HOA Dispute. Board President Faces Financial Review." It was shared 1,200 times on Facebook in the first 48 hours. The Kerrville Daily Times hasn't had a piece do numbers like that since the 2011 wildfire coverage. Darlene Pute submitted her resignation as HOA president by email on December 19th. She did not offer a reason. She did not respond to Van's request for comment. The check for $12,000, the accumulated self-dealing payments, was repaid to the HOA operating account in January after a brief negotiation that Philippa handled and which I was not party to, but which Otis described to me as efficient. The new HOA board was elected in February. Otis Williams became president, which suits him perfectly. He runs meetings in exactly the time they're supposed to take, sends notices exactly when the bylaws require, and has never once carried a lanyard. Harlan Cross joined as vice president. Shelby Prudhomme, who had helped organize all the documentation, became treasurer and implemented an actual financial oversight process, including annual independent review of the HOA accounts. The windmill is still turning. The aquifer is still full. The water still runs to all 11 houses on Crescent Fork Drive, cold and clean, and tasting of limestone the way good Texas water does. In the spring, the neighborhood held a block party. The real kind, not the kind Darlene organized where certain people weren't invited. Everybody came. We set up tables in the cul-de-sac, and Harlan smoked brisket for 9 hours. And Shelby made a sheet cake that said in blue frosting, "Water rights still flowing," which is probably the nerdiest cake I've ever eaten and also one of the best. I did one more thing, and it was the thing I'm most proud of. The quiet title action, the attorney fees, the water system backup installation, the total legal and infrastructure cost came to just under $14,000. Philippa had agreed to a reduced rate because, in her words, the case was the most fun she'd had in a courtroom in 5 years. I also received in late January a check from the HOA's operating account. The repaid $12,000 was by board vote, designated for a specific purpose, the Olin Callahan Water and Land Stewardship Scholarship, named for my grandfather, administered through Schreiner University in Kerrville. Annual award to a Kerr County student pursuing a degree in environmental science, agricultural engineering, or rural land management. First recipient, a 20-year-old from Ingram named Truly Odom, who wants to study aquifer hydrogeology and came out to my property in March to see the windmill and asked me 45 minutes of very good questions about the gearbox and the distribution manifold. Grandpa Olin would have liked her a lot. The windmill will outlast me. The aquifer will outlast the windmill. The easement, now confirmed and recorded and permanent, will outlast all of us. Darlene Pute is, as far as I know, living in the same house on Crescent Fork Drive that she has always lived in, receiving the same well water she always has from the same windmill she spent 2 years trying to destroy. I see her car in the driveway sometimes. We do not wave. That's all right. Not every story ends with forgiveness. Some of them end with water flowing, a scholarship funded, and a gearbox turning in the hill country wind the way it has for 32 years and counting. I'll take that ending.